Welcome to Pr0totype. Yes, it has a 0 in it. This is solo podcast content about game design. I figure early episodes of this show are mostly going to be focused on Cosmonarchy Brood War, which is, of course, the hitherto biggest mod ever created for Brood War and actually seen play. That's what our community is mostly rallied behind at this point, while we continue to work on our original games and our original RTS engine. But I'm sure there's going to be some overlap between some of the Substack writings that I've been doing. Maybe this will even be areas where I explore content that I turn into a Substack article in the future, or vice versa, where I've written something and I want to revisit it, and I happen to decide that it touches on some topic that I want to talk about here. And ultimately, I like to do some talking. I don't know if you guys know that. I usually do several hours of talking every day because I do video castovers of, replays, or I'll do streams, or I'll do podcasts or whatever. So I do like the sound of my voice, guys. And it sounds like you guys do too. So, of course, if you want to show your appreciation, you can leave a comment below telling me what your favorite caw moment has been, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something actually useful to comment, but comment. There you go. There it is. Now, there's probably also going to be a lot of times where I talk about something that isn't related to Cosmonarchy Brood War, but is actually related to some of our future titles. Obviously, there's loads to talk about with Onatar and Antikythera and Zabalba, Cosmonarchy Retail, and maybe some of our non-RTS games as well. And it might just end up being a place where I vent my frustrations at playing a terrible game and talking about how I would definitely want to do things better. So we'll see where we go. I suppose you could kind of think about this as a higher quality dad call or something like that, where maybe it's not just specifically related to channel updates or whatever, and it might be a little bit more targeted on game design in specific. That being said, this is essentially just going to be conversational content that is more about the here and now. What has been happening now? What has been happening lately? And for episode 1, I want to go over some of the recent changes to CMBW, and after that I would like to record the final section of this episode after we play Fraudarchy today, because I am recording this on the 18th of February, and it is a Saturday, and Saturday means Fraudarchy. And if I have any thoughts on some of the subjects that have been here, or I have new subjects I don't want to bring up at the very end, then of course I can do so. And yeah, it's going to be a little bit exploratory. Maybe we reuse this particular format in the future, but obviously not every single episode of this show is actually going to be recorded on the day that we play Fraudarchy or whatever. So unlikely that it's every episode that's like this, just based on that alone. So let's get right into it. The recent changes to Cosmonarchy Brood War. I've written down a few that I want to talk about. I think the biggest one is probably the launcher. And it's weird to call it a launcher because technically it just downloads. It creates shortcuts which you can then use to launch. So it facilitates the launching of the game, but it is not actually what you run to launch the game, if you know what I mean. There were obviously some early troubles, and I'm sure that was very confusing for the average person who just got handed an EXE and told, yeah, this works, but do this first. And then, oh, there's a new EXE, but, it doesn't update itself, and so on and so forth. And, I'm sure there were some people who were maybe wishing that we had done a better job with that or something. But I think the coast is clear. And obviously I made a video on YouTube specifically talking about the launcher, so you guys already have seen that. Presumably it's only like 2.5 minutes and has mic in it, so you should see it if you haven't already. And because it's stabilized now, I actually think that that's like the first big hurdle. We can't really automate, for obvious reasons, by the way, we can't really automate creating like an exception into the folder for your firewall or antivirus. And Windows Defender will definitely defend your PC from being able to play the mod, which is, of course, it's a God-given duty, apparently. So that is something that ordained by the higher-ups over at Microsoft. And it makes sense because, obviously, StarCraft mods use code injection to hack over the reverse-engineered bits and replace the part of the executable with the new code. And that is pretty much word for word, mechanism for mechanism, what actual viruses can do, at least some kinds of viruses. So it makes sense for Defender to pick that up. But obviously, I think I've read it somewhere several times. Your best antivirus is just your brain. You just use that thinking organ and make sure that you're not downloading something stupid. And obviously, if there's like hundreds of people, or in this case, maybe 100 people total, who are playing this and enjoying it, and you can see like active games happen all the time and on the daily, I'm probably not Bitcoin mining them all. So if I was going to Bitcoin mine somebody, I would probably have the system requirements set higher anyway, so that I can guarantee I actually get Bitcoin. But at this point, I don't even think Bitcoin is useful. So I have no idea. I don't keep track of that shit. But you get the idea, right? So based on that alone, hopefully the word of mouth can help spread that out of the way. And of course, it's on the setup guide to say, hey, you don't need to worry about this. It's safe for your PC. You have to just trust us, bro. It's on the internet. You read it on the internet. That must be true. And on top of that, you also have like instructions for, setting an exception in your firewall or whatever. And that's one way that you can get around it. So hopefully that resolves most of the people's issues out there. But the launcher will definitely make updating in particular a lot easier. We did have some trouble recently, and I'll get into that as my next point. Just yesterday on the 17th, we had tried to do some significant witness mode improvements and replay improvements by taking a function that basically it's like the master function for any inputs that get saved to a replay in single player or that get synchronized across the network in multiplayer. And obviously in multiplayer, you do both. And this game receive function, as it's called, obviously had been hooked and not really been exhaustively tested. And when I say exhaustively, we tested a bunch of things on a programming sense, but we didn't actually do a real world test where, in this case, Veek, who was doing the change, and myself, who was just testing with him, we didn't play a game like a quick 1v1 to see if there was any problems. And then the Shambler and Mystery meet over in the server. Regulars, by the way, if you want to play with them, of course you can. You just join the Discord server and say, "Hey guys, I'm here to play with you," and then you wait for them to be available. That's how it works. But those two in particular were trying to play games, and every single one of them ended in some sort of technical disaster. And when I disabled this hook, it seems like those problems had gone away, although I didn't get super clear confirmation of that. Technically, it could have been the Shambler specifically having some update issue because it didn't seem like Mystery Meat was having problems. But for all I know, it's just because Mystery Meat was doing some different thing, right? Like this hook in particular that we've done, this function touches so much of the game. And even though we tested every single individual command on its own, we didn't really do our due diligence testing just a real world example. Like a single game would have exposed that this was a problem, and we didn't do that, right? So as a result of that, it has made me realize, like, okay, well, for one, in this particular case, we definitely should have done more testing on this. But for another, I think this is probably a good idea because it is maybe untenable for, Veek is also working on Antikythera, our engine, and I'm literally at work on that day, but, maybe doing something else, right? Maybe it doesn't make super sense for us to worry about, hey, we have to exhaustively say the bug doesn't show up in every single game and we play a couple of games and it seems fine, but then there's a more obscure edge case where it breaks. That is something where it's a little bit more understandable why we would have missed it. And so if we push it to pre-release and leave a notice saying, hey, there's this new thing, it may result in instability, and then we update the release repository, instead of only doing it once a week, we update it when there's actually something stable, and we're also initiating something potentially unstable in the pre-release branch. Then people can say, "Oh, I'll try it out. Oh, it crashed. Here's the report, and I'll switch back to release because I don't want to crash." And then it would all resolve, right? Everything would be fine. But in this particular case, it was happening one day before the weekly update on the release repository. So when they went back to the release repository, they were dealing with basically a very different early game, right? Some things were very distinct. And maybe there were even some bugs that got fixed in the meantime that were a little bit deleterious, right? And so the bottom line, I think, is probably that we just push to the release repository more than just once a week. We also will do so when we're in the middle of shipping something that is significant. And ideally, we wouldn't push to release ever unless we had already tested it. But in this particular case, we had tested everything up until the game receive hook. And so it made total sense for us to not do that. It made total sense in this case for us to push to release before enabling that hook and then pushing the enabled hook version of the game to the pre-release repo. And then, letting people know, hey, this is potentially busted, because we just haven't been able to test all the different things that it interacts with because it's literally like a core function of the game. And at the upshot of this eventually is that obviously we're going to have witness mode improvements. We're going to show APM in replays and in witness mode, and that's really good. Witness mode, by the way, is our version of observer mode because the observer unit has been renamed to witness. And later on, we also played The Witness by Jonathan Blow on this channel. Well, I say by Jonathan Blow like it was the only one. By Thekla and etc. By everybody who was involved in that project. Anyway, Witness is a pretty good game. The Witness. You should check it out. But yeah, we had some fun there. What else was I going to say? I totally lost my train of thought just talking about Jonathan Blow. But the main upshot is that we will eventually get it working and get that very important and useful feature, because then I will be able to make fun of people's APM for live on these castovers, and that'll be epic. But we definitely jumped the gun here, and it did cause, I think it was actually 3 people. I think Ian was also involved in some of these games, judging from some of the screenshots. it caused 3 people to basically waste like a couple of their hours in their evening. And we recognize, at least I recognize, and I think I've convinced Veek as well, though I don't think he really needed much convincing, to be fair. I think he realized the problem pretty quickly. When I phrased it like this, that's like maybe 2 hours per person. So we wasted 6 hours of time in this case. And that's not really good, right? Like nobody likes that. Also, you could be doing so many things. The fact that you guys are dedicated community members who are going to play Cosmonarchy Brood War, obviously you think it adds value to your life because it's a fun game to play. And you got some people who you like playing with and against. But ideally, we wouldn't be throwing you through hoops. We would just, that's one of the reasons why we made the launcher, is to obviously make it more accessible for the average person, but also so that you guys don't have to waste your time thinking you updated, not really fully updating, causing some desync or crash later on or whatever. And then, oh, I guess I have to redo that and we wasted time playing games and stuff. That the whole upshot of all of this stuff is that we waste less time and we are making it easier. And so the change that we're going to be making based on that is just to, like I said, when we've actually tested stuff on pre-release and we're about to deploy something to pre-release that is not yet tested and maybe dangerous in this case, like the game receive hook, we will probably push to release so that you have a stable thing to fall back on. Technically, if you have Git installed, you could obviously just check out as a group in using the command line and stuff, but that's another reason why the launcher exists. We don't really want people to have to wrestle with Git in order to play the game, right? So I think that all makes sense, and hopefully people understand. I'm glad that we nipped it in the bud in this case, because now we've experienced this error, and it was unfortunate for those guys because their evening had a little bit of trouble at the very end of it when they were trying to relax and play some games and yada yada. But at the very least, we were taking steps to correct it, and I'm glad that we did so in this case because the cost is comparatively low. If we did this to a group of players, we ship something and 10 people or 100 people, God forbid, or something like that, like all of these people have problems later on because of this, we can actually point back to this moment and say, all right, we're not going to make this mistake again, or if we do, there's even less excuses for it, right? And so anyway, figured I would mention that because that's something that was on my mind. We can get into some discussion of balance changes now. You guys know I like my balance changes. I don't like my balance changes unless the game is explicitly still in a development phase, which you could say, I guess, for CMBW, although it's obviously just a mod that we're fucking around in, trying to find a good formula for, what might be the future of the RTS genre, right? And how might we deploy some of those things, and what lessons can we learn? So the first lesson that I think is imparted based on some of these changes, we've done a slight increase in the time cost for certain things that you build mostly in the early game. I say slight, it is only 5 seconds in every case. The reason why I was not going to be, it was originally suggested that I should do 10 seconds or maybe even entertain more. I think 5 seconds is probably the most I'm comfortable with, and I'll explain why. But first, we'll say that some of the basic structures for Protoss, you're thinking Gateway, Cenotaph, Lattice, and Automaton Register, all got 5 second time increases. The Stargate did not, and that's the only tier 1 military structure that did not get increased, but that's because it costs 125 gas, and I don't really think it was that abusive in the early game. And really, we're not even thinking abusive in this case. But the Quasrock Pool, the Hydrock Den, and the Zorka's Shroud got time cost increases. I actually believe the Zorka's got 10-second time cost increase, but it got an actual mineral cost reduction of 25 minerals. So you make of that what you will. But the idea behind the time cost increases is to make it feel more like, hey, I'm going to need to plan a little bit in advance. And that's actually the reason why I didn't want to go beyond a +5 time cost, because when you're thinking about it in those terms, suddenly you're in a situation where you can't actually, in good conscience, say, I'm just going to build this ahead of time, right? You have to build it so far ahead of time if the time cost increases that it might actually make adapting mid-game, especially in the very beginning of the early game, you might be sort of backed into a corner where you don't have enough time to build your barracks or your gateway or your Quasrock Pool or whatever because of the fact that I've done these time cost changes. So we already have a slight reduction in how frequent these structures are built very, very early on. And that's just because you have less minerals available to you at the beginning of the game anyway, because of the mineral yield changes and how people don't have 10 mineral fields in the base and whatever usually. And so most maps will result in you having a slower initial structure purchase in the first place. But beyond that, you also have to think to yourself, is there an additional layer to this, right? And I think that additional layer of, okay, we have to, we get it a little bit slower. That's already something that people have started to adapt to in the meta side. And, you scout anyway and you figure things out. But in this particular case, I think the +5 second is really just going to be a minor thing that changes the standard of exactly what time you can have a structure up in most cases. And that's really all that it is. A very minor adjustment, but there was a reason why I did it, and that was because it did feel like maybe your first couple military units popped up a little bit too early. This is just my own personal preference, I suppose, in terms of like the frequency of games ending super early, or the fact that, your first really important fights can start to happen at 2 minutes in or something. And maybe I want there to be a longer baseline of time of investment necessary in order to win a game in a 1v1. And I also think this will be mostly helpful and healthy in team games as well, because that's more players being affected by it. And as a result, you will probably see larger pools of armies shared between teams. And that will probably increase the amount of time that, before you can actually successfully break an enemy or something. And of course, that's subject to a lot of different chances. Maybe one guy decides to greed and go for a quick second base or third base or whatever. And, who knows what happens. But I mean, that's another thing technically, is that if you go for a more delayed tech structure or military structure, depending on your race, then yeah, maybe it does mean that you can expand a little bit easier or something, right? And so just, once again, making it so that there's a couple of different options. I think this is just going to help with all of those things. It's not really going to bring about a huge meta shift unto itself, and it shouldn't cause issues where you can't adapt in time. And it's just that sweet spot of like a tiny middle ground, like quality of life change almost, where it's just, bringing more and more structures in line and more army timings in line. And hopefully that is the end result anyway. And now you know why I did it to begin with, and also why I only did 5 seconds and not anything else. Except for the Zorka Shroud. Fuck the Zorka Shroud. Just kidding. I do think actually that it is supposed to be this tier 1.5 structure for Zerg, and that's always what I thought about it. However, I'm sure that there will be some more changes to some of the units that come from there if I want to solidify that. I think the Lakisalisk looks really good at this point. Obviously, it's very expensive, and the Gorgor is in a solid spot. I think maybe the only thing that I'm on the fence about at this point is the Zoryustaleth. It has consume, but nobody seems to be using it. I suspect that if you did use it and you had like a Zork's Quasra combo, you would probably be in a pretty good spot to just heal a lot from that. But it does require APM and positioning. And so, we can't really do corpse targeting. You can't consume a corpse. You can move the unit over it like the Ultra Core, and maybe that would be enough. But the unit already has a lot of positional related gameplay to it just from its passive. So maybe we get rid of consume on the Zoryustaleth and replace that utility with something else, or just drop the mineral cost slightly or something. And, think about that some more. But yeah, upon further reflection, perhaps the only thing that needs to change about the Zorka Shroud is actually the Zoryustaleth. I think people probably just they underestimate how impactful those can be. They are super tanky. So, and if you ever need some sort of meat shield, then you kind of know where to go. That said, there are some more balance changes I would like to talk about. Up first in this list is pushing Terran out of a reliance on bunkers, and to a lesser extent, a reliance on tier 2. The way that I've decided to try to achieve this is by strengthening their tier 1.5 options. This is stuff from the medbay and stuff from the scrapyard. Obviously, Terran does feel very gated around bunkers in the early game. I think a large portion of that is because their fulcrum units can be very powerful, but are very dependent on positioning, and can be overwhelmed in numbers by the opposing races. The other issue is that, of course, the barracks units end up dying very quickly. And I think by making clerics a little bit more durable, actually Shaman's also got an armor buff, and then by separately making the Blackjack a little bit more efficient in terms of its DPS by increasing its weapon cooldown, or decreasing its weapon cooldown slightly, so increasing attack speed, and by making the Matador even more durable, you're probably in a very solid position to have more options, more compositions that can be effective. Obviously, if you imagine clerics with blackjacks, those are a really good synergy because you keep the blackjacks on full HP, and the lower their HP, the less stats they get from their passive, which means that they are less cost efficient. But as it stands, I mean, technically, if you really wanted to, you could go for a very low gas oriented build where you go for like medbay is being your first bit of gas, fulcrum being another bit of gas, and then you just add scrapyard and starts pumping, blackjacks with clerics, it can be a pretty good combo. And so that can actually mean that you save up enough gas while having a decent combat-oriented army to eventually tech up, right? But it does feel like Terran have the hardest time actually ending the game in the early stages, even if they end up doing some smart moves. And it's attenuated by the fact that they have the strongest defense in the game, between units in bunkers being super valuable, between, eventually getting sentinels and phalanxes, watchdogs obviously being maybe the highest DPS anti-air structure in the whole game, and eventually getting to ion cannons, as Kian has wailed against a few times now, or railed against, I should say, but wailed sounds like he's crying, and that's a little, he was salty, but not that salty. That being said, there's many different options that you have, a lot of them being in the later tiers of the game, and that means that it does feel like their early game did get left aside. In TVT, you can actually have some very interesting banger games where you don't really need to be bunkered down, because you don't have the same level of mobility or the same level of consolidated power that your other races do, right? Where Zerg can have they can overwhelm you with Hydra counts in the early game, maybe. I think Protoss might be the hardest matchup right now for probably any race, because of their flexibility, but also because of the raw power in a lot of their units. And maybe some of this will also be attenuated when we end up making some of the shield stats a little bit more sensible now that flash shielding has been implemented. I actually forgot to do this ahead of Fraudarchy, but I was planning on dropping the Hierophant shield count from 100 to, I don't know, at the very least it would be 80. But they have double the shields of a Drakodin with the same amount of HP. It's like, they have one less armor, technically. That's the only thing, though. It's very, very difficult to actually kill those things, it feels like. Unless it's a sustained fight where they don't get any shielding, of course. And maybe that's one of the reasons why, when you consider the fact that they move very fast, that's one thing. But they're also very close range units. So as a result of being kind of on the shorter end of the stick in terms of the weapon range department, that's probably why I made them as durable as they are. It just feels like you could probably drop their durability a bit and then drop their cost a bit, and they would feel a little bit less like binary or abusive. And maybe that'll be something to explore after Fraudarchy. Depending on how many people decide to build them, and during Fraudarchy, we usually have higher player counts, which means we have team games or FFAs, which means we don't really see too much of the early stages of the game as much. But maybe in more 1v1s, Shambler has taken a liking to them. Maybe he'll demonstrate some of them. I'll be able to add a little bit more data to whether or not they need more adjustments. But going back to the Terran side, I think stronger blackjacks, more durable matadors, clerics, and shamans. Clerics might actually be a little bit abusive now. I haven't had enough data on that change yet to come to a conclusion. But beyond anything else, I do think that this should give more options to Terran. It might feel like they just don't have enough options compared to some of the other races. But that's, I feel like, a little bit of a mirage, because when you consider the fact that Zerg has less units at their disposal in the early game, they have 4 units from Swarm, because you got to count the Vorverkor, and they've got the 3 units from the other branches. They have less units, unique units, than, of course, the Terrans do. And I think Terrans are on par with the Protoss. They might be, well, no. I think it's exactly the same in terms of actually tier 1, but obviously Protoss can just go for sequestered icon early on or whatever. They can go for a lot of things early on that Terran can't go for. And their raw power of a lot of their units in terms of durability and stuff is obviously maybe a little bit out of whack, but just in general, you would say higher, right? There's more concentrated power for Protoss, and that's their whole racial identity in many ways. Now, the Terran side is very different, where maybe it just feels like a lot of their options that they do have aren't particularly useful. And I am open to that being the case, but you got to remember that if I specifically target anything other than durability, if I target their DPS in any way, or their weapon stats in any way, like adding more range or something, it is going to result in bunkers feeling even more powerful. And so we might have backed ourselves into a design corner here with the fact that bunkers can be so powerful. I would just like them to not be the only thing you have to pick from. And I think that when I dropped building movement speed a little bit after, Mystery Meat showed that you could do a one-trick pony, just fly your barracks across the whole map to scout and stuff. When you have situations like that, you realize, there was a miss here, and you didn't notice it until somebody abused it, right? And that's fine. But if we don't need bunkers, then I think Terran will be in a better spot. That being said, I think Terran will still appeal to people who fundamentally play the game on a bit more of a turtle-y side, because they have such powerful turtle, it's really hard to break. that being said, good players against that will just take a lot of bases and settle in for the long haul instead of feeling like they have to end the game super early. That might mean that some of your games go on a bit longer versus Terran if you're another race, or even if you are Terran and your opponent is deciding to go for a turtle-oriented move. But at the same time, they could just as easily just spam like 30 barracks or whatever in the early game and just start hounding you with infantry if they really wanted to start to try to, use the fact that you can't break them to their advantage. So it really depends on how the game plays and where what the map is and what your opponent is actually doing. So I don't think it's exactly terrible that bunkers are as powerful as they are. It's just, I would like them to not be the only thing that Terran has to their name to hold on against an aggressive opponent. And that mostly comes down to their army not really being able to compete too much or too well against the opponents. And Cyprians being slightly more durable. A while back, I added plus 10 HP to them. And probably in general, like all of the healers and stuff getting slightly more durable should assist with that in general. And hopefully we end up in a spot where Terrans can be a bit more competitive, even if they decide to not just bunker it out. If we set our sights onto Zerg, we can talk about the Muthrok Spire now being tier 2 instead of tier 2.5. Also, in accordance with this, I have decided to increase Mutalisk armor to 2 from 1, and also increase their attack rate a little bit. So their attack speed has been increased slightly. Actually, I think it's significantly. On the website had the wrong stats. And basically, it was like maybe an idea that I had a while ago to make it so that the weapon behaved in that way, but I never actually made those mirror changes. So that's just one of those drawbacks to having to maintain all of the unit stats in multiple places, is you can't really remember in what spot did you actually make a change you intended to make, and in what spot did you not. And you hope it's all in the game files if you had to pick one or the other, but there's got to be a few that clearly I did not do properly, from having the idea and changing it on the website to actually remembering that idea in time to change it for the game itself. So that's in anyhow, and you can consult those changes if you want. Their weapon damage got reduced from 9 to 8, and they are still on 3 armor pens, so don't worry about that. But their attack rate is now 1 second instead of 1.5 seconds. That's pretty significant, as you might imagine. Might end up making it feel like they're really busted, but and of course this combines with like the +1 armor to make them probably quite useful. I mean, them going to 2 armor from 1 means that vassals, for example, will deal fucking nothing to them. But most attacks will probably be able to deal with that. Like Mavericks have 1 armor, so they will deal 1 less damage to them. They have 1 armor pen, I should say. Mavericks having 1 armor pen means that this change will reduce their efficacy. But I don't really think many people were going for Mavericks versus Mutas. It's just if the Zerg actually got Mutas, it was at tier 2.5, remember? So a lot of the times the Terran would already be on the Madrigals and stuff. Realistically speaking, this should help out in a few spots, and I think that will make a lot of sense. So those are some of the thoughts that I have. And I think that in general, you're going to see this be a nice change in just for the future, for seeing exactly how we're going to combat this feeling of stagnancy for Zerg, which I'm not convinced actually happens, but people have said a little bit in the past that like some of the structures in particular feel like maybe they unlock units similar to the Gorgon actually, and Terran Air in general. It's like the Starport required Fountainhead back in the day. Now it requires just the Atlas, but the add-ons require Fountainhead, and the Mantle also requires Fountainhead still. And that feels a lot better, like the Captaincy also only requiring the Atlas. It cleans up a lot of things where like the Daedalus would technically give you add-ons for a structure that if you didn't have the Fountainhead added on to the Atlas, you would actually not have access to. So the Daedalus unlocked the commandment back in the day. Meanwhile, if you didn't bother building Fountainhead, then it was actually useless. So some of its power budget was actually not available to you unless you made an additional expense beforehand that wasn't required to get to the Daedalus either, right? So that was definitely weird. But that being said, I do think that we're seeing, generally speaking, healthier tech progression since those Terran changes. And now if we think about the Zerg one, just having the Spire available to you from tier 2 is probably fine. If there needs to be something to address the power of Sikralisks, Protethilars, and Mutalisks, then I can do that separately, and they can be more tier 2 oriented units instead of being this sort of unit that might as well have been tier 2 but was actually delayed, right? So hopefully that also will make it so that when you do get tier 2, when you do cough up that 600 gas and then keep the structure alive long enough, You can decide if you want to just upgrade your existing tech structures or if you want to go into Muthrok instead of having to, of course, add the Irradiant Avoa to the list of things you have to buy, just so that you can build more tech structures. Of course, I think the highest power budget tech structures were the stuff that's still gated behind tier 2.5. In terms of the, like, between, we're not including tier 3's tech structures in this assessment, but the Izkag-Eteth and the Matravel Nest are very, very powerful structures in terms of the units that they provide you with. So it actually still makes sense, and I think the Avoa is still valuable. It's just slightly less valuable, which does concern me a little bit. Now we can roll into talking about the Clarions. They have returned, and the reason why I think this is important to note is that, well, some people didn't actually know that they returned, but they are back, and Simulacra were updated as well. Knight of the Realm had a funny idea where if Simulacra, like Vassals, gave you 2 per requisition, what would happen? And that was because there was a point in time where actually they were very weak. Now, they ended up being slightly over-tuned or in terms of the actual stats they had. I didn't increase the cost enough. I only increased it by 25 minerals. So they're a little bit more expensive now, and they take a little bit longer to build. But obviously you're getting 2 of them instead of 1. And that alone is very big. They lost 1 armor pen because I don't really think it was ever really that healthy for a very cheap unit to be having. I think it was 3 armor pen or something. Something crazy. Maybe it was 2. But whatever they have now is what I feel like they should have had the whole time, because they are meant to be this, like, you could imagine them being counter to small arms fire that usually coincides with low durability. Like you think about Zethicors and Quasilisks, or you think about even Hydras to some extent, but obviously they have armor. And then you also think about like Terran Bio. And then maybe you think about like some of the, I guess Robo v Robo Sims would be like pretty powerful against themselves to some degree. Obviously versus Vassals, they'd be pretty solid, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do that just because, like, I mean, you can, but it's kind of Tismic to just have Sims versus Sims and etc. That being said, the thing that I think is the most impactful about this change is that now Simulacra are actually useful instead of being kind of a meme. Yeah, well, I guess I'm recording this, and I probably will release it in the same day that I release the very long castover that I recorded earlier today as well, and that will be the day after Fraudarchy. So this will be the 19th of February when you're listening to this, if you're listening to this on the day it comes out. And you will have seen that a lot of players float a lot of minerals. Well, mineral-only options are legit. Clarions, of course, the reason why I packaged them with the Simulacra update is because when you deal damage to 1 sim that's shielded by Clarions, you deal damage to all sims that are shielded by that Clarion, and you can imagine how powerful exactly this is. Because obviously you're dealing damage if you break the shields and deal some physical damage, then wow, suddenly you're going to be splitting a lot of sims. So that interaction is very cool, and I mean, it's kind of the same thing, whereas like, is Thraithaleth Plague or, Irradiate or something like that. Some sort of damage over time effect that plagues, that damages a specific unit will also damage all of the other units. And so it does seem like you'd be getting a lot of splits, but you'd also be doing a lot of fucking damage. So Clarions are kind of countered by damage over time effects in that sense, but it's still, if it's only a little bit and you can, deal with it, then it can be quite beneficial to you. So I think that's sensible. I think that makes sense. And when we combine all of that with the fact that Clarions in general are quite powerful as supportive units, sort of like I've heard it compared to the Antseal. Realistically speaking, the Clarions are a little bit more nuanced than that because they spread shield damage. So it's not like they shield all units underneath them for energy or whatever. That being said, you can just focus down the Clarion, right? Because when their shields expire, you're dealing just direct HP damage, and that's not spread. So that's pretty good. And I don't think that they're in an unhealthy spot, but I also haven't seen too much of them. Obviously, I only saw Veek show up with them when he was fighting Ben, and actually they didn't really feel like they were supremely powerful. My suspicion, as I was explaining the interaction between Clarions and Sims, is that because the shield damage is only split when a victim who has, like, if you're dealing damage to somebody's shields, it's spread across other units, but it might only be able to deal damage to shields, or if it doesn't, it might only be able to deal damage to, like, spread the damage if it is impacting shields, which would be the letter of the ability. And so if you're attacking a sim and it eventually it spreads all of the initial damage, but then their shields break, you're only going to be dealing hull damage to one sim. So it probably isn't the way that I just described it, where you can deal damage to a bunch of linked sims and then thus everything will be fine. because you're only dealing shield damage to them, and you have to deal some form of hull damage. So I think Clarions with Sims specifically, if you want that interaction, you pretty much need to be fighting against some sort of AoE. Like you think about the salamander fields, or you think about like something with a bounce attack maybe, like something that can then damage even just a little bit of scratch damage on a bunch of Sims at any one time after the shields have been broken, courtesy of the, like you're basically allowing all of the Sims to break each other's shields using the Clarion, and then all of the Sims are eligible to split if they take additional AoE damage or something. And that's probably what you would want to do. So in retrospect, maybe Clarions are actually better with higher shield units like Archons or whatever, but there's plenty of experimentation to be had. I think that's going to be everything that I wanted to cover in the initial sequence here, so I'm going to shut up and get ready for Fraudarchy. And following that, we'll maybe have some more things to talk about. There are some things I want to look forward to that I already kind of hinted at, which were like APM and witness mode and in replays once we fix game receive. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we are going to be trying to resolve CCMU. It probably won't happen until early March because it does seem like it's more of an involved change. And we don't want to rush things, as we just found out with the game receive thing, while we're also juggling work on Antikythera and our Indie Fund pitch. So expect a little bit of a return to form while we wait for determinations from the Indie Fund pitch, where we do decide to maybe do some of those bigger tasks like CCMU and more involved replay support and whatever else. But as it stands right now, I feel pretty good about the launcher and about all the changes in balance and about the changes in philosophy about, you know, what exactly constitutes a change that's stable versus not, and when do we decide to push to release and all this other stuff. And I hope you enjoyed this part of the first episode of Pr0totype, and join me in just a few seconds for the second part. So we are back, indeed, with the last section of Pr0totype, episode 1. So, yeah, it's actually been a little bit. It's not just immediately after Fraudarchy that I recorded this. It's actually the next day. It is 11:37 in the morning on Sunday, the 19th of February. And hey, we did play a Fraudarchy. It was kind of scuffed. Some of these events kind of are. We didn't have a crazy turnout of people, and yet we had like the perfect amount of time where we couldn't really play like team games because it was an odd number for most of the time. So we played some FFAs, we played Fraudscendants, we played a bunch of different things like that. Then we found some interesting bugs with Fraudscendants, actually. We also found some, just reminded ourselves that the unit limit does exist. So obviously I did talk about how we wanted to resolve that in the future. Probably early March, looks like, is when we'll really get around to start investigating that. I've started to familiarize myself with the changes, but nothing yet in terms of progress. So let's talk about some of the subjects I wanted to sort of rattle off here before we close out the episode. The first is map design in team games, specifically. We played on Mother Entropy, which is a 3 versus 3 map from Night of the Realm. And we did so in Fraudarchy, in the rare case where we actually had 6 people around, and we could play a team game in that sense. We played a few different games, actually. We played Mouth of Bethala afterwards. But the situation that we found ourselves in actually both games is partially due to unfamiliarity with the new map, but also partially due to the distance between the different players. It was really hard to coordinate a defense, and that does, in general, contribute to this sense that people have where whoever has the first strike is actually favored in a lot of cases. You know, they have all of this initiative, this momentum. And I don't think you can really get away from that, nor should you try to legislate against that. You don't want an overabundance of comeback mechanics, and you don't want defenders' advantage to be too overwhelming. You want it to be a considerable factor, enough so that if you play well, even if you've been, caught off guard, and especially if you do know where the enemy is coming from and what they have, so that you can prepare in kind, that should result in you taking the dub, at least in that engagement, and then being able to level out and try to figure out your next plan of attack, but have a relatively even state, or maybe even you have the advantage because of all of the economic sacrifices that were made to facilitate something like that. Mother Entropy is a very large map. I believe it's 256 by 256. And as a result of it being so big, you have a very long distance between the player mains, and that allows you to get an economic advantage very early on relative to what you would normally have. I say advantage, I guess you'd have to think advantage over who, but basically all players can expand pretty early on, and you can try to rush, but is it going to work? And that's the sort of the question. And there's also some interesting design decisions, like there's a solo ridge somewhere, and it's like, who would ever take that unless you're Zerg, maybe? Because at least when you're building Hatcherosks as Zerg, like in that case, you might as well build it, where you can just send 2 workers to harvest from the resource, and it's almost incidental that you get a little bit of gas increase. But otherwise, it's like, you're not really going to be shattering people's ideas of what makes sense. You can use the town outpost, but for Protoss, it's a little bit more expensive, and for Terran, it's not until tier 2. And all of those things are fine, whatever. People can have their little quirks that they like to explore. And maybe it will turn out to surprisingly be effective. Solo gas bases, when there's a decent amount of gas, actually does seem to make sense to me. But I'm not sure that the same can be said for like a single ridge in some corner of the map or whatever. However, all that being said, I think the map design in team games, you probably want to acknowledge the fact that you have this early advantage in initiative if you can successfully focus down one player. I don't really want to get into a world where all the team game maps are in a situation where everybody is in the shared base, and there's only 1 or 2 paths into that base. I like the idea that you have lanes of engagement where, there's actually some of these examples in like that old map Megalopolis by Balethal. I think maybe the execution was a bit off, but the concept of it is pretty solid, where you have, these exterior players who can focus themselves on the main lane into their respective corners of the map. And then you have the interior players who can focus their attention on getting maybe a bit more of an economic lead and presence, but also, sacrificing some of their economy so that they can spend it on military and defense and whatever to hold the middle of the map. And that's where sort of you would imagine like, oh, well, 2 players worth of units can go there or whatever. And so something like that could definitely work, where you have responsibilities depending on the players. This is obviously the intentionality behind, Tectonic Kingdom and Mouth of Bathala. It's a little bit harder to play something like that when you are playing on Celestial Rift, which is the 8-player map that I made, a 4v4 map where everybody kind of has a shared base area and they're pretty close to each other so they can help out, but I think the biggest problem is that it devolves into insanity very quickly after that, because there's just so many different bases and, the paths are kind of wacky and stuff. So definitely could use some work, and maybe it's just better to remake that later on. But some of those are some of the thoughts that I have. And I think when you're thinking about map design in team games, you have to account for that power of, multiple players to gang up on one player. In the case of Mother Entropy, it didn't really matter that much. Obviously, there was a little bit of action in this exact game where some vultures started tickling Mystery Meat, and it was actually Kian's vultures, and he thought it was an XY symmetry map, Mystery Meat did, and he showed up in the opposite corner and started attacking Beaver, who didn't even target him at all and wasn't even involved in the fight. And I mean, that's fine. Like, you can decide who to target based on a bunch of different things. But if you were trying to like get back at somebody specifically because they attacked you, and you assume that they have less stuff at home as a result of, doing an early rush, because I hit him with a lot of Zethicores and killed an expansion and stuff. Like, when you're in that situation, that can be quite difficult to fight back against, especially if you don't know where the enemy is. And so that's why I say it's a lot of map familiarity things. But also, if you're, in a situation where the pathways themselves do not sort of terminate in one specific spot that then forks out into a couple of other, situations where you could imagine many pathways to get to, like, say, the center of the map. And then the center of the map then can fork into, each one of the players' bases. If that is hard for players to keep track of, and it's difficult for people to understand where the enemies could come from, it's really going to make it a lot more difficult, I think, for you to account for, how many players are attacking one player and how many forces are coming in, even if it's just from one player. Like, if they have a lot of forces, you got to account for that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing you have to account for in the level design. And so this is sort of still like a sub thought, if you will. It's like not fully articulated, but I do think that having the pathways be a little bit more uniform, or a little bit more like immediately understandable, and maybe having these termination points where there's like a cluster of pathways that end in the same spot before they fork out somewhere else. Just knowing where those are and having them be close enough for players to guard, but not close enough that if somebody gets the jump on them, they can instantly go anywhere, right? Because that would be maybe too much power in one single connection point. Then that could really be a problem. If you have that proximity where I can put a bunker here, or I can start, at least observing this with some units or lay mines or whatever race I am and stuff. Then at the very least, I can have presence over there, and I can tell when somebody is massing up to attack. But if the concentration points are too close or too far, it becomes either too punishing to sneak up on somebody, if you even can do that. Like maybe it just doesn't have enough defender's value, or it's too far away for me to actually defend it sensibly, because then maybe some air units could thread the needle and come in somewhere else, or there could be a drop or something like that, right? We're all familiar with the idea that if you're trying to defend a vast area, you're only really as strong as your weakest link, and it's up to your opponent to actually find out where your weakest link is and abuse that. But if they do, or if they happen to chance upon it, then it's actually quite difficult for you to relocate your forces, especially if they're ground oriented. This is not a bad idea, actually, from one of the players on the other team, Alice, who decided to go for a bunch of Goliaths and load them into Trojans and just try to ferry them around the map, because that's actually really strong ground forces, but they actually have the added mobility of the transports being able to sort of ferry around and try to defend allies and stuff. But the map size was still a little bit too prohibitive for that, and I think maybe... I guess it would be my position that you shouldn't be forced into doing that, right? Which is probably pretty sensible and agreeable for most people. Not that I think it was necessarily forced. Like, this isn't really a slight on Mother Entropy specifically. The same kind of thing can happen even on Mouth of Bathala, which is a much smaller map, where if your allies are a little bit too slow to help you out, and you happen to be the frontline player, or maybe the outer player that's on the low ground, you could easily get overwhelmed by multiple players and then not be able to do anything. And I don't know to what extent that's a player skill issue, or to what extent that's a map issue, but it is something that we have observed so far, and it's just interesting to muse on it. Maybe some people who are listening will have some ideas. Like, that's another thing. Obviously, this community is growing, and we're getting more and more people involved. We're getting more and more people mapping. And I guess that's another point that I can raise here in the end of this episode. It's really interesting to see how people are approaching different things, right? Dark & Fantasies recently decided to start playing, and obviously you saw him on the castovers. If you missed those, some of them were pretty entertaining. You could check those out. The other thing that he started doing was he made a 1v1 map, a map called Wellington, and it's made entirely out of custom tiles, which I respect the grind, homie. But it's really rewarding to me, and I think I said this in one of the castovers. It's really, really nice to see like a close friend and somebody who's I've worked with for quite a while now, and we've contributed to each other's projects, although admittedly he's contributed a little bit more to my project than I've contributed to his lately. And he's learning some skills, and he's responsible for the pending unit, in-game unit extender. He's responsible for the bullet extender that's already in the game. So he's been padding his skill list, with assembly knowledge and whatnot, and being able to reverse engineer things. And that's really, really cool and shocking. Like, I can't believe that anybody was able to do it, let alone somebody who, up until maybe in the last year or so hadn't really been dabbling in programming too much. That's really shows you what you can do when you put your mind to it. But the lessons of that sort aside, it's really cool that he started to work on stuff, right? And then obviously, like, Ben Taberski's in the server, and he's working on maps, and he's got a very different sort of style than a lot of other people do, but he's exploring, and he's seeing what's possible within the confines, right? And then Night of the Realm's back to making maps more regularly, and Veek made 2 1v1 maps recently, and obviously I'm continuing to do that. And we're getting more maps, we're getting more people, we're getting more castovers, we're getting more content, we're getting just more games being played, right? And it's like a daily thing now for quite a while. I think maybe we're going on a full calendar month, calendared fantasies of the games being played on the daily, right? That's really cool, and that's something that's like sort of a milestone of sorts, right? It's like, wow, we actually get to this point where people are playing something that we made, and it's happening every day, and we're getting interesting data, and we're sort of crowdsourcing that information and stuff. And that's going to happen as more people get into mapping. That's going to happen as more people get into, we even had Solstice on the server. He's John A on the server, but Solstice in the YouTube channel. And obviously you may have seen a castover that featured him. He was starting to work on some Blender updates, to like some model updates or whatever to the exact way to color the files and stuff. And so like some of the graphics we might actually get upgraded insofar as they blend better within Brood War. Like they match Brood War a little bit better. And like, that's cool too. Like, that's not something I was thinking somebody was just going to start doing, and that's the same thing, right? It's like, there's a lot of improvements to the game, a lot of improvements to the mod, and a lot of like crowdsourcing that information and those ideas and whatnot. And so as I make content like this, And whoever decides to be hardcore enough about Cosmonarchy Brood War or my work in general, or the No Frauds Club in general, to listen to something like this, where it's almost an hour of me talking about whatever's on my mind, and it is, of course, related to game design and stuff, that could also, maybe people will have some takes on team games. Maybe people will have some ideas for what can be done to make the team maps a little bit more stable, I guess, and without, just having really long map distances, because I think actually that doesn't even solve the problem. It just slightly delays the point in time where somebody just gets ganged up on, right? And so anyway, all of that said, I think it's cool to have that opportunity. Obviously, I was starting to broach the subject of many people making maps and stuff. I guess I could talk about how I feel about the current maps that we have available. I do think that, for example, Terminus has some pretty good, it just has some good games that have been played, which I think is the ultimate metric, is like, as more people play the game on the map, how good are those matches? And Terminus seems to be delivering pretty good ones. I'm trying to apply some of those lessons, and at the same time, there was the map Sunstarved, and I say was because it's not deprecated yet, but I think it will be. I don't think you can really fix the flaw of the map at its core, which is that the mains are just very, very close to each other. And despite the fact that I don't think I can really salvage the map, I do think I learned some really, really important lessons. Stuff like, don't put your resources right up against ridges like cliffs, and expect that players will be able to defend them. And I've always tried to experiment with making visually appealing layouts, and a lot of the resources being just in the middle of nowhere often does feel pretty bad, like visually. And so I decided, okay, well, I'll sort of buttress them against these cliffs. And then now we have air units, and now those air units obviously can abuse you over the cliffs. You think about like Panoptus, you think about anything from the Astral Omen. Obviously, you think about like Calculusks in Tier 2 for Zerg, and you think about a few other options. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty bad. And, there's also things like people finding these tiny little holes that you can drop artillery in or Cyprians in or whatever. And I'm thinking to myself, like, man, I really wish I could just paint the pathing over that so it wasn't droppable, because it's not intended to be. But in order to actually fix that, it would be a very arduous process where I have to manually paint every single tile with some copy duplicate of it that just happens to not be walkable. And then that introduces inconsistency on the tiles anyway, which I guess painting the pathing manually would also do. But it would be a little bit more understandable where it's like, here's the author's intention. And so anyway, there's all of these considerations that I have. And I'm thinking to myself, really would be nice to, like apply some of these lessons, right? The lessons I learned about, resource placement relative to cliffs and, distance between the mains. And I always like to experiment with, interesting layouts. Like I think Mouth of Bethala and Sunstarved share this in common, where the pathways between the mains, like actually the distance is fairly short, but you do have the opportunity to sort of move around and do things differently. And I think Megalith Empire has been a much better success in that sense, where you get to see a very short distance between the mains, but the paths there are kind of singular insofar as they are very straightforward and you can account for them relatively easily. The one there's two paths that are much more roundabout in the nature of how they get to you to the base, but they are also possible to account for as the player a little bit easier. And then the main, more straightforward one, you can just put a bunker down there. I mean, there is a neutral bunker you can garrison to yourself if you decide to get there first and stuff. And so, yeah, there's like different things that can attenuate the fact that the main distance is short, right? Like the fact that the minerals are up against a hole instead of a cliff means that you can see past it. And also there's a little bit more build space behind it. And so there's things that, lessons I've learned basically from Sunstarved and then experimenting with Megalith Empire. It just feels like a much better map to play in that sense. And so hopefully I've done a good enough job articulating some of the lessons I've learned. But I do think that the main thing is that as I'm learning these lessons, other people are maybe learning different lessons, or maybe they're like it's not a binary thing where I'm on level 1 or level 3, we'll say, because 3 and they're on level 1 and they have to get to my level. It's more like, a lot of people will have their own sort of ideas of what makes a compelling map, and they're going to explore that, and then they got to see what the pitfalls might be. Like I think Knight of the Realm with Brimstone Disco is probably aware that a lot of the pathways in that map are a little bit awkward. And after it's seen some play and after it's seen some castovers and maybe after he plays it himself a little bit, which I believe he has recently, he might make changes to address that and all this other stuff, right? And that's like one example where maybe I would have been able to observe that without actually needing to test, but maybe I would have done very different things anyway. And so maybe my maps would have been weaker in some way or missing something that actually his maps have that I just don't consider, right? And that's like the beauty of having the crowdsourced idea where there is that community aspect where people are making stuff, and it's just more data for you yourself to consider as the designer. Of course, this is not the same thing as crowdsourcing game design, but it is interesting to hear what people think about, something like map design, where I don't think it's solved. I don't think it's even close to being solved. And also, it's something that I'm not pouring my heart and soul into day in and day out, or I would have more ideas on it, right? Because I'm also working on other games. I'm working on the engine with Veek. I'm working on all this other stuff. So my plate is very full, you could say. Anyhow, I guess our last subject here will be what makes an entertaining castover. And I think this is a question that I guess is also best crowdsourced to some degree, but I think I could speak for a lot of people when I say that castovers generally should be done of matches that have some sort of back and forth to them, where it's not really clear who's going to win, or if it is clear in one sense who's going to win, if it seems obvious, if that is ever subverted or made more tense or interesting by, like, you thought this guy was going to win and maybe he does eventually win, but along the way you're like, oh man, he could have lost that there, and that was actually pretty scary, and so on. I guess the classic example would be like the first game with me versus DF in the 2-game series that were sent to Mesk. So that was the game where he just built nothing but Dracodons, and it very much looks like I'm going to lose in the first game, but obviously that doesn't end up happening, spoiler alert. And so just seeing how that is possible, like how that's that is interesting, right? That can be compelling. It's like, oh man, he's holding on. Can he really win? Does he really think? Why doesn't he just GG go next? And then finding a way to win, right? In fact, I don't know if this is true, but I think all of the games I've been a part of on the castovers that have been uploaded, I think all of them have been me winning, except for that FFA where I end up GGing out because I was tired and wanted to sleep. Amongst other things. Also, I lost everything. That also contributes. But besides that, I think I've won every game that's been on the castover. So I swear this is not intentional. Like, if there was a really good game that was played and it was back and forth and it was like, oh man, who's going to win? And then, again, it ticked all the boxes of it being a good castover, but I ended up losing. I definitely wouldn't, I wouldn't be like, oh, don't send that one to Misk. Nah. If it's a good game, it's a good game. And hopefully that will happen at some point. I've been trying to play games. I tried to play some games with Kian on Wellington recently, and I sent the replays to DF because he might have some ideas for the map. But they were fairly quick games, and I don't know if one-sided is the right way. I felt puzzled by the outcome, I guess you could say, but nonetheless, it was one of those things. So the games just didn't end up being very interesting. I don't even know if the games have to be very long. I think maybe the length of time should probably be, like, at the least you should be able to cross 15 minutes before the game ends. But that's also probably in the eye of the beholder, so who knows? And yeah, for me, entertaining castovers are ones where it's not immediately obvious what happens, especially if something silly happens, like, proxy ion cannons or some crazy shit. Like, that can be really funny. There's that game that Kian and the Shambler had where they both proxy Trusk themselves, like each other. There was a hidden base in the corner from Kian, and then there was one from the Shambler who did the mineral only or the mineral heavy base on Terminus and stuff. It's like, that's silly, right? And so stuff like that can be very entertaining, especially if the game then somehow turns into a longer game, despite all that. And so yeah. These are just some of the observations I've had, but these are all questions that I'm very interested in other people's responses to. So if you happen to get this far into the video, into the audio only podcast content, then I definitely want to know what to you is the most entertaining castover, or what kinds of things are entertaining about the castovers. I think I have a pretty good idea of what all of those are, and I think a lot of it is based on, like, it's not very obvious. If it's a series, then it goes back and forth, right? If it's a game, it goes back and forth, and maybe something funny and silly happens along the way. To that extent, probably the FFAs are the ones that have the most of that, but we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see what people say. So yeah, that's going to do it. Close it out here before we hit an hour. And that was the first episode of Prototype. I don't know if they'll all be this long. I don't know if they'll all be this short. You never know. But I had a lot to say this time, it seems like, and I'll continue writing some topics for me to do on another episode. And I will see you guys later on. And yeah, Stay tuned. Keep playing games. Keep sending us data. Keep sending us replays. And bye.